Thank you. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be a guest of Aspen España and a guest of La CaixaBank. My first encounter with Barcelona was 25 years ago, and I've been back and forth to this wonderful city, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 times. But you might wonder what a mountain man from the Rocky Mountains of Colorado has to say to bankers on the shores of the Mediterranean. I'm a philosopher by training. I come from halfway around the world, and I'm here to tell you that I have nothing to say to you. And now we can go to the reception, which is why you're all here. In all seriousness, I don't have anything to say to you about banking, but I do have many things to say about the context of leadership in an era of globalization. And I'd like to start by telling a little bit of a story of the Aspen Institute and the Aspen Institute's vision of leadership, because I think it's quite different from what happens in business schools, and it's quite different from the broader culture that we typically encounter. And I'm glad to say that the Aspen Institute US was conceived 65 years ago in Madrid this week. In a letter dated October 26th, 1949, Ortega y Gasset wrote to the founder of the Aspen Institute in Chicago and said, "You do not want to start a university. You want to start an institute for continuing education." And up until that point, the prospective founders of the Aspen Institute US had thought about starting a university. And I'll say a little bit more in a second about why they wanted to start an educational institution. But Ortega wrote to them and said, "No, don't found a university. You want something like the Institute for Humanities that I've founded in Madrid." And that letter, 65 years ago this week, was so persuasive to Walter Pepke, the businessman who started the Aspen Institute US, that he abandoned his plans for starting a university and instead, 1 year later, founded what was then called the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. So it's a particular pleasure to be here in Spain, all the way from Denver, Colorado, to close the circle 65 years later of an idea that started here in Spain. But the story goes back even a little further. The 3 men who started the Aspen Institute in the late 1940s looked at 2 world wars and a Great Depression, and they said there's a problem with how we're training our leaders. Our leaders have great technical capability, but as they looked at world events, as they looked at war, at genocide, at economic collapse, at political destabilization, as they looked at totalitarianism to the east, they said there's a problem with how we're training our leaders. This technical capability runs the risk of outstretching our capacity for making moral decisions. So this gap between the technical capacity of human beings and our moral capacity is something they wanted to bridge. The gap between what we can do and what we ought to do. And they said the only way that we can foster a greater sense of what it means to make humane decisions is to bring people into conversation with one another. We can't teach people how to be human, but together, they said, we can learn how to be more human and more humane. At that point in time, the great concern, obviously 1948, was the fact that we had invented and used the atomic bomb. So our scientific capacity was something that was very much on the founders' minds. Now I think we can add to science and technology the tremendous technical ability that we have in finance and our financial institutions. These are tools, and tools can be used for good and for ill. How then do we decide, how do we cultivate the habits of mind that allow us to use the tools for good? So that was the first element that they observed, looking at 2 world wars and a Great Depression. How do we use our science well? The second thing they observed in leaders, among leaders, was the lack of context. And this is something that we still hear a lot about today. The leaders of 1948, they said, were narrowly focused. And this narrow focus came from, in part, the university, where we go to disciplines, we go to faculties, and we learn one thing very, very well. But of course, I'm trained as a political scientist, as a political philosopher, and political philosophy has a lot to say about how the world works and doesn't work. You all are trained largely, I gather, in economics or in management, and those disciplines have many good things to say about how the world works. And yet, unless we have that kaleidoscope of disciplinary expertise, we lose focus on what it means to be fully human. So they said our leaders need context. And again, the emphasis here was on the scientists who had developed the atomic bomb. Had they thought, their argument went, more about how this technology might be used, we may not have invented something that at the time and still risks destroying all life on the planet. So the gap between technical ability and moral ability and the need for greater context to break down the silos of our social knowledge were the two fundamental drivers for the founding of the Aspen Institute. So what did they do? They decided to convene a powwow of ideas. I have no idea how powwow translates for those of you who are listening in Spanish. They decided to design a festival of ideas. And in 1949, they convened in Aspen a gathering of 300 intellectuals in this small silver mining town. Among them was Ortega y Gasset. Other luminaries, Thornton Wilder, from the world of arts, Arthur Rubinstein, to bring musicians in contact with playwrights, to have musicians, to have politicians, to have people from the business world, all talking together to break down the silos, to think more deeply about the context of leadership at the mid-20th century. This festival also attracted Ortega, in addition to Ortega y Gasset, Albert Schweitzer, the great philanthropist, whom they lured to Aspen, telling him that it was just a short distance from Chicago. It's about 1,000 miles, but they persuaded him to come. Schweitzer went on to win the Nobel Prize a couple of years later. And Schweitzer delivered an address on the 200th anniversary of the birthday of Wolfgang von Goethe, whom they took to be the last great humanist of the Western tradition, someone who could combine knowledge of politics, knowledge of arts, knowledge of science, of literature, of music, and so conceive this full dimension of what it means to be human. And that gathering was such a success that in October 26th, 1949, Ortega responded to this letter from Walter Paepcke saying, "What do we do next?" And so a year later, 1950, the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies was born. Ortega, in his letter to Walter Paepcke, said this. He said, "We need to revive and nourish elegance. Modern culture dangerously limits our essential nature, that is, the ability of the inner self to live intensely through thinking, through imagining, through loving, and through feeling." He said that an institute in Aspen should be very limited in instruction, but it should be highly concentrated on education. What is the difference between instruction and education? Instruction is a training, and we need training. We need those technical skills. But instruction is one direction this way. Education is bidirectional. It's multidirectional. We don't need more spaces, Ortega said, where one person delivers information to another. We need spaces where people can come together and to think creatively, to come to understand each other better, to understand the well springs of the values that animate the decisions that we make, to open ourselves to different ways of learning, different ways of knowing, different ways of being. And Ortega famously said, "I am myself and my circumstances. I am myself and my circumstances. I am I, but the I that I am is formed, shaped, reinforced by the circumstances in which I live. And therefore, nothing I do can be separated from the society of which I am a part." And so the Aspen approach to leadership development says, let's put the values that we have as individuals in conversation with the values that inform our organizations. But those sets of values are inseparable from our conception of the values that undergird a good society. I can't act unless I have a sense of the purpose for which I am acting and its effects, not just on the I that I am, but on the circumstances in which I live. And for Walter Paepcke, who was a businessman from Chicago, business had a key role to play in leadership. We think a lot about leadership, particularly in political terms, sometimes in artistic or cultural terms. Paepcke felt very firmly that in a modern democratic capitalist society, business people, businessmen and women, had a fundamental leadership role to play. It's true, he said, that business serves society, but his great concern, particularly as he looked at the Soviet Union, an alternative model of social and economic organization, his great concern was that if business people did not understand the economic, the political, the social, and the moral and spiritual values that undergird a free and productive society, that we would lose the fabric of that society and be vulnerable to what was then the communist threat. So business depends on society in this original vision, but it also must rise to a leadership role. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But Paepcke wrote a year or two after receiving this letter from Ortega, he wrote this: "The complications of business in society have never been greater. The need for leadership in business has never been more demanding. The opportunity for leadership from business has never been so open to us. These needs cannot be met without technical competence, but competence is not enough. Nor are the commonplace slogans. Leadership demands both vision and understanding." And so, as a philosopher coming to you from the Rocky Mountains, I want to take the very high view. What does the landscape look like from 4,000 meters, quite literally, as we're down at sea level trying to navigate the stormy seas of a turbulent economic situation, a turbulent social situation, a turbulent political situation? So I intend to speak a little bit about the Aspen approach and then to chart the landscape of the challenges of leadership in an era of globalization. In particular, the role of values in society, the role of culture in an organization, and then finally the internal territory of how we come to the decisions that we do. But before I do that, I should say that Aspen is a conglomeration, it's a family. It's an international organization that was started in the US with these roots from Madrid, but there are now 10 international organizations all participating in the Aspen spirit. And so even though I'm a philosopher, the quick biology lesson is this: an aspen grove, you can picture a group of aspen trees. Each individual tree is its own organism, yet under the ground, they're united by a common root. And that symbolizes very much the Aspen family. So Aspen España was founded 4 years ago by Spaniards, for Spaniards in an international context. And the other Aspens are similarly founded So they're independently funded, independently governed, they have their independent programming. And I say that in part because I'm very grateful to have been a guest of Aspen España these last 4 years, but also because as an American, it's wonderful to be part of an international project that's not an imperial imposition. We are a family, and we learn from each other. The other Aspens exist in France, Italy, Romania, Germany, India, the Czech Republic, Mexico, and Japan. It's a wonderful international network in which we, from different backgrounds, from different parts of the world, come together and engage in ideas. We're equal partners, the same spirit of open discourse, but different actions. So what exactly then is the Aspen vision of leadership? There are 4 elements. Values. The values that we hold, the values of our organizations, as I said, the values of what constitutes a good society. And in all of those, there are tensions. Right? We're constantly negotiating differences of values in every choice that we make. We need a space in which we can explore those tensions of values. And when I say that Aspen is an idea and a spirit, there are core values that we can say, but those are values that are always introduced in conversation and they're tested, refined. We do that by dialogue. And again, there are 3 kinds of dialogue. There's the dialogue that we have with the ages. So we'll read Aristotle, Plato, Cervantes, and talk about the perennial elements of the human condition, not with an eye to recapturing or reclaiming the past, but to inform us from the past and help us think more creatively, more imaginatively about the future. So the conversation with the past, what Walter Pepke and Robert Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago, who was instrumental in founding the Aspen Institute, what the 2 of them called the great conversation, the conversation of humane discourse. The second conversation that we like to talk about is the conversation among peers. So this is a very unfamiliar format for me because I'm used to having 20 people around the table in which we're constantly asking each other questions and there's a give and take. And we'll have a chance, I hope, after my formal remarks for further conversation. But the premise here is that no one of us is privileged in this conversation about what it means to be human. We each bring our different technical capabilities. We bring different expert knowledge, but none of us is an expert on what it means to live a fully formed human life. And so the only way that we can get better at that is by listening to one another. So the conversation with the ages, the conversation with peers, and then finally, the internal conversation, the conversation that ideally we're having with ourselves every moment of every day. Am I asking myself, why am I doing this? Am I asking myself, am I being responsible? So the conversation with the ages, the conversation among peers, and the internal conversation are part of this vision of leadership. The values, dialogue, the third element of the Aspen vision of leadership is to take the long view. And I was very pleased to see that in CaixaBank's statement of values. Too often, we run at a very, very high speed in which we're reacting, we're responding, and yet we get to a point where the next day we say, if I had taken 1 more minute to think about that, I might have decided differently. So what does it mean to take the long view? It means to have some conception of what's lasting, what's permanent, what endures about what's best in us. It also means thinking about building not only individual lives and cultures that endure, but building institutions that endure. If you look at the Fortune 500 list from 70 years ago, Of those 500 companies on the list 70 years ago, I think 40 are still on that list. That's a sobering thought. What does it mean to build a business that lasts? Walter Paepke's business, the Container Corporation of America, no longer exists. The Aspen Institute does, and 65 years later, we're extremely strong, in part because we're constantly testing those values, constantly testing our programs to see what will endure. So how do we take the long view? And then finally, the fourth element of the Aspen approach to leadership is to put the human person at the center of everything that we do. It's to ask again and again Socrates' question, what kind of lives are we supposed to lead? Aristotle famously makes the distinction between the good man and the good citizen. We can talk about the difference between a good accountant or a good philosophy professor and a good human being. They're not always the same thing, and the structure of our lives is such that we spend most of our time perfecting the art of being good professionals. And that's a good thing to do. But if we divorce what it means to be a good professional from a good human being, then we've missed the essence of that elegance that Ortega talks about that sense of vitality of what it means to be and live a full human life. So values, dialogue, the long view, and keeping the human person at the center of our focus. And Walter Paepke said of the kinds of values seminars that we run, the purpose of a seminar is not to make us a chief financial officer a better chief financial officer. It is to make a human being, however, more self-aware and more self-correcting. How do we become more self-aware and more self-correcting? And if I ask you at the moment to do a bit of a thought experiment, think of the people with whom you work, think of the people whom you manage, and ask yourselves what things would look like in your organizations if the people you supervise were more self-aware and more self-correcting. How does that happen? Stage 2 of the thought experiment is this. Think of the people who supervise you. What would your world look like if those people were more self-aware and more self-correcting? We can talk about that in question and answer if you'd like. But then this is the hardest part. They're asking the same questions about us. What does it mean for us to be more self-aware and more self-correcting? So to create a space in which that kind of learning, that kind of education, that drawing out one from another can happen is at the center of the leadership vision that we have. So how do we do this? We have public convenings, and I should say that we're strictly nonpartisan in all that we do. So we have public conferences on policy issues. We have policy seminars with content experts. But what I'd really like to focus on for a moment are the values seminars that we do. I just came from our 4th edition of a values seminar that we do in Ronda every year in October, where we convene 22 people for 4 days and have conversations about human nature. What are human beings like? Are human beings more or less good, or are they more or less bad? Do we structure our management style? Do we structure our organizations on the presumption that human beings are going to do the right thing or the wrong thing? Human nature, fundamental philosophical concept, absolutely central to how we operationalize our day-to-day lives. We talk about what it means to be free. What does it mean to be free if we think of freedom as being free from the arbitrary interference of some other authority, on the one hand, or on the other hand, what does it mean to be free for participation in a community, free to orient ourselves toward a notion of the common good? Two different conceptions of freedom, arguably in a globalizing world, Western freedom has the first accent. Freedom means not having other people interfere with us. For much of the developing world, much of the non-Western world, the idea of freedom is arguably a sense of solidarity with a broader community. What happens when those two notions of freedom bump up against each other? How does that affect the way we conduct global business? So having a moment to stop and think about these philosophical distinctions actually has profound implications for how we conceive, how we understand the context in which we do business in a global environment. So we look at transatlantic values. We ask the question whether there are human values that undergird all of our common life, or whether there are some values that are culturally specific. When we think about corruption, for example, are we dealing with two competing value systems? And on what basis are we going to decide, quite apart from our notion of the rule of law? We talk about the future of Europe, levels of subsidiary authority, of regulation. We talk about nationalism. At this seminar last week, we had several Catalonians, we had a Scot, and we had a Ukrainian. That makes for a fascinating discussion, I assure you. Fascinating and lively. And we can get into that if you want. What is justice? What is equality? These are fundamental issues which, if we don't stop and take a moment to think about them, then we go on at great speed and make decisions without understanding the contours of the values landscape. So together, we think, we listen, and we strengthen our moral muscle, you might say, our intellectual muscle. The texts that we read are tools. They provide important distinctions for thinking about the issues that I just mentioned. But they're also mirrors that we hold up to ourselves so that we can look at ourselves and say, if that is my conception of justice, do I actually live it out? Because when we talk about values, there are values that we hold as principles, a list of things that we believe to be true, we think to be true. But then there are also the values that inform our choices. They're the values that take the shape, I value this because I choose to spend my money, my time, my energy on those things. So two different sets of values, how do they align? So the texts we read are tools for analyzing, they're mirrors for looking at ourselves, and they're also springboards for talking about contemporary issues. So we might start, for example, with a reading from Plato, but we'll end up talking about why it is that some people use black cards and some people don't. We play with ideas. We clarify individual and institutional purpose. But fundamentally, we step back so as to have the clarity and courage and conviction for when the crisis comes. Because the biggest decisions, the ones that rise to the top, are not technical decisions. The numbers say X or Y. They're moral decisions in which we're having to balance off one value against another. A value of individual autonomy against a value of community, and a value of economic efficiency over and against some notion of equality. And unless we actually take time to step back and reflect deeply on the values contour, we're very ill-equipped to make the decisions in the moment that we need to make. The classic example from the Aspen history of this is an American case that's now a Harvard case study of Tylenol, where the pain reliever was deemed to be unsafe. And the man who made the decision, against the arguments of much of the company, to recall the Tylenol product, had spent 2 weeks in Aspen, just a couple of weeks before, thinking about these issues. And he said that when the crisis came and they had 12 hours to make a decision, the fact that he had taken time to think about the broader values context did two things. One, it made it easier for him to understand that the right choice was to recall the product. The second thing is that it gave him the courage to say to the legal team, to say to the executive team, to say to the engineers, this is the right thing to do, and to persuade them that it was so. So what at the moment seemed like the worst choice is now celebrated as one of the best choices. And again, when we're faced with the challenges, we want people who are self-aware and self-correcting to be in the position to make those choices. The other thing that comes out of these seminars and this approach to leadership development is a network of peers. So we have people from different sectors, from the banking sector, from science, from politics, from academia, from the law, from business, talking together and understanding what it means to be in each other's shoes. And it will come as no surprise to you that this last week in Ronda, there were two primary objects. Actually, there were three primary objects of attack: bankers, politicians, and nationalists. But if you have to spend 4 days with bankers, politicians, and nationalists, and you eat together, and you play together, and you have deep discussions together, you come to an understanding that not all bankers, nationalists, and politicians are the same. It turns out that they're very reasonable, happy, fun, well-meaning. They're human beings. And that mutual understanding, I know that comes as a surprise, that understanding goes so far in breaking down the barriers that we have that lead to a discussion in which we can move forward together. It sounds simple, and it is simple, but our experience is that we don't have the time, or we don't take the time really to understand what the world looks like from someone else's point of view. Now, there was no agreement that came out of these discussions. In fact, when we talk at Aspen about leadership directed toward common ground does not mean agreement. There's no attempt to form a consensus. Common ground, however, does mean understanding why the other person holds the position that they do, why the other person has the values that they do that are expressed in that particular way. And then being able to work together, not because you agree, but because you understand why and where you disagree. One of my favorite moments in the executive program in the United States, the leadership program, was a week-long seminar in which we had one very, very strong Republican, one very strong Democrat, one white, one black, one rich, one worked for an NGO. They would not even sit next to each other. So of course I sat them next to each other. And it took 4 days. But on the fourth day, they each looked at each other and said, I used to think people like you were stupid and mean-spirited. Now I understand that your core value is individual autonomy. You believe that if you've worked hard for something, you should be able to keep it and do with it what you want. And the other said to the first, I used to think people like you were mean-spirited and stupid. But now I realize that your fundamental value is that of communal solidarity. And you want to have a more equal society, even if it means taking things away from other people. Now, the implications of that realization are profound. Did they come to agree with each other about matters of public policy? No. Could they work together for a common purpose? Absolutely. And as it turned out, as a result of getting to know each other, they came from almost identical backgrounds, even though in middle age, they looked really quite different. And so that mutual appreciation allows us the context, and it allows us to break down the silos that get in the way of genuine creative leadership. So at the level of public policy, the implications are tremendous. Right? Do we have redistribution or not? What's the degree of redistribution? But also at the level of organizational management, the implications are tremendous. As you think about the people with whom you work, which of them are the ones who are strongly committed individualists who want to get things done and move on? And who are those who really want a long consensus process? And sometimes we think of some as being obstructionists and others as not wanting to pay attention to what the others want, when in fact they're unselfconsciously living out a core value. So both at the level of public policy and at the level of organizational management, the focus on values becomes fundamental. But to understand that takes time. And we often hear from senior managers, I don't have time to spend 4 days, even if it's in a nice place like Ronda or Aspen, Colorado. I don't have 4 days to think. And what they find is, at the end of 4 days, they wish they had another 7 or 10 or 14 days to continue the thinking, to continue that deep introspection and that understanding of other people that allow them to go home and work with their employees, work with their supervisors, and indeed engage their families in a profoundly different way. Because we lead not only at work and not only in society, but also in our homes. So what do we value? Why do we value it? What is my role in nourishing those thoughts in myself and in others? Nourishing those thoughts, feelings, actions, choices that uplift us in our humanity rather than degrade us. That, in short, not that short, is the Aspen vision. So let me briefly say what this looks like in the 3 different areas that I outlined before. What does this look like at the level of society? Values and the good society. We need trust and we need stability. And you understand that more than anyone else, I think. When we have great instability, it's often the result of a combination of deteriorating material conditions. It's a result of unstable institutions, but it's also the result of dysfunctional beliefs. And unless we can put those 3 things together, the material conditions, the institutions, and the beliefs, we won't be able to address appropriately the challenges that we face. For many years, not just in this country, not just in Europe, but certainly in the United States, we've assumed that successful material conditions were all that was necessary. But as someone asked in Ronda 2 years ago, when the money runs out, what is it that holds us together? When the money runs out, what is it that holds us together? If the institutions are weak and the beliefs are dysfunctional, when the money runs out, there's very little that holds us together. So it seems to me, and I'm not in a position both as a philosopher and as an American to tell you what you need to do, but it seems to me that banks, as well as other institutions, need to address both the material and the moral conditions of our common life. We think of investment primarily in financial terms, but there are also investments in the social sector. There are investments in our institutions, and there are also investments that we make in what I'll call our moral and spiritual common life. What can we do in our respective institutions to foster that kind of investment so that the return on the investment is not simply material, but also social, political, moral. That's a challenge, because if the other institutions aren't doing it, if the political system is dysfunctional, and the institutions of civil society are weak, and the money runs out, then we no longer have the resources to live full, humane, common lives. Both in the material dimension and in the moral dimension, there is a kind of reflexivity or feedback loop. So the banks certainly reflect choices, as do the political institutions, the other institutions. But it seems to me that we have a challenge as well to lead. Can we affect the kinds of choices that people make so that we have a more robust social and political fabric? It will come as no surprise to you that while many were criticizing the bankers and the politicians, there was a sense of hopelessness. But if one sector is underperforming, it's incumbent upon the other sector to rise to the occasion. And we all know that this is not simply a public relations campaign. People are weary of politics and economics. They're cynical of politicians and bankers, in large measure because they see a good PR campaign that's not always connected with the real stories of growth and benefit. So we have to deliver a message that sings, but the note has to be pure. There has to be integrity to the actions. What does this mean for organizational culture? You're all managing teams. You can't give bonuses, you can't give raises very often. So we ask the same question. What holds the team together when the money has run out, when times are tough? A lot of the executives that I work with in the United States emphasize that culture is the most important aspect of any organization. And we have to think very, very carefully, very critically about the ways in which we cultivate that culture. Most people have to work, so they depend on the paycheck. Most people take the greatest satisfaction not from the paycheck, but from a sense of satisfaction that comes with their own values being in alignment with the values of the organization. And I know in my own work, I have a very small team. Most of my team never see the transformative conversations that happen in our seminar setting. And so I work very hard to connect, to tell the stories of what happens in that setting so that their sense of satisfaction is renewed. So again, what holds us together when the money runs out? If that substratum of values isn't there, then the teams become weak. The focus on values, that focus on purpose, also helps us think about what it means to take risk. If we're confident in the direction that we're going, then we have a little bit more latitude, not to take unwise risks, but to think about creative action, to be able to ask those questions, do we really want to do this? Or what if we did this instead? If there's that fundamental trust that comes with an alignment of values, it becomes much easier for a team to take risks. And when those risks fail, there's something to fall back on. There's that sense of common trust. There's that sense of common purpose. And so part of the challenge for thinking about values in the organizational setting is to reflect and indeed to ask those with whom we work what it is that they value about being in the organization. The answers will be very surprising if you foster a space in which they feel that they can speak frankly. Aristotle's definition of virtue is this, and I think it's philosophically true as well as organizationally valuable. The definition of virtue is to do the right thing in the right way, at the right time, for the right reason, to the right person. To do the right thing in the right way, at the right time, for the right reason, to the right person. Again, it sounds very, very simple, and yet we know in all of the activities that we do how frequently we fail at that. And I'm convicted of that in almost all of my interactions with my 19-year-old daughter. So this is true not just for organizations, but for us in families. How do we cultivate that understanding, that sense of context that allow us to connect with those with whom we work and live at the level of values in forming a culture in which collectively we're better able to do the right thing in the right way, at the right time, for the right reason, to the right person? And that leads me to the third and last dimension of this values landscape in a globalizing era, and that is the level of our personal values. One of the key elements of the Aspen vision of leadership is that we are human beings who are body, mind, and spirit. And unless those three are united in a fundamental way, we can't make the kinds of decisions that elevate the human personality. So as we think about our decisions, are we making decisions out of fear or hope? Again, a thought experiment. If you think back this past week, how many of the decisions you made were based out of a kind of reactive fear? And what would it mean to create a personal landscape where the level of stress is such that you're making decisions not out of fear, but out of hope? Secondly, what are your resources? When we speak of material resources, we speak of human capital, but what about the moral and spiritual capital? How can we develop a moral and spiritual fabric in our organization, in our organizational culture, and in society at large, unless we're taking the time to cultivate that within ourselves? How and where do you go to replenish your internal resources, particularly as we move faster and faster and faster? It takes time, and the time that we take to invest in our own moral development multiplies itself many times over, not only in the way in which we're able to be more at home with ourselves, but also more at home with those with whom we work. There are no black cards for our souls. We can't keep spending our interior resources endlessly. So, take a stress test. What's the stress test for your soul? How do you know when you have the resiliency to withstand the next crisis? And where will you go to replenish those resources? So, taking the view from the Rocky Mountains, that is a vision of leadership not understood as a technical training, but as a kind of pilgrimage in work and life. Training in leadership is a training in elegance, decency, and courage. And so I'll pick on a hometown Barcelona, at least later in his life, Barcelona favorite, Pablo Casals. And I love the way in which he plays the cello to achieve that pure, rich note. Casals said, each person has inside a basic decency and goodness, If he listens to it and acts on it, he is giving a great deal of what it is the world needs most. It is not complicated, but it takes courage. It takes courage for a person to listen to his own goodness and act on it. And I would add that it takes courage to help others act on their goodness. And I'll close by invoking one of my favorite characters from all of literature, Don Quixote, who has a kind of bizarre courage, a courage of his convictions, and we would have to have a much longer conversation about whether those convictions are well-placed or ill-placed. But it seems to me that one of the things that we can learn from Don Quixote, one of the things that I try to learn from Don Quixote every day, is to be able to laugh at ourselves, which is a kind of humility, but also to be able to have the courage to stand firm even when others are laughing at us. And it may seem Quixote-esque to pursue values in this day of competition, of corruption, of political and economic uncertainty. But we are the authors of the story in which we're also players. And unless we take the time to think about those convictions and to redouble our sense of courage in conversation with one another, then we will be chasing windmills after all. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions in English or in Spanish, although I'll need some help with the Spanish. And I spoke longer than I wanted to, but I really do want to engage in a conversation because it seems to me that's the essence of the Aspen spirit. So we've already contravened the fundamental principle, which is I've been talking at you, but I hope that's food for further reflection and conversation. Let me say in closing how inspiring I find it being here in Spain. I lived for 3 years in the UK, and while I recognize that the UK is a problematic part of Europe, it's still more European than the other side of the Atlantic. And I actually feel much more comfortable in this part of the world than I do in my own. I'm irretrievably American. And yet there's something that Europe has, there's something that Spain has, that the fast-paced, rootless, restless American culture increasingly lacks and feels a longing for. And so when in our seminar in Ronda with Aspen España we talk about transatlantic values, yes, they are the propositional values of human rights and dignity and so forth. But I think together we're working on a new habit of living in which we need to draw upon each other's strengths. And so as you seek, to the extent that you do, to imitate a kind of dynamism that the US has, don't forget about your Spanish and European roots. When I was running in Madrid yesterday in Retiro, I came across this magnificent tree, and I'm sorry, I can't remember how to pronounce the name of this magnificent tree. It was planted in 1633, and when the French occupied Madrid, they actually moved their cannons so that this tree would be preserved, would be in less danger of being destroyed. The seedling of the tree, the tree itself is not native to Europe, it comes from Mexico. And for me, as I've been thinking about it the last 36 hours, it's a profound metaphor for the common challenge that we face. We have a seedling from the New World that has grown for almost 400 years in the Old World. And it's 50 meters tall. And it seems to me that that's what we're striving for if we take the long view. We need soil that is rich enough to put down roots. Because the stronger those roots are, the more nourished they are from the soil of our common values, the taller and stronger the tree can grow. And so as we look to the future, let's not forget to look also to the past, not as something that we want to imitate, but as a source of nourishment that as we make our choices, we can become stronger and grow into a culture that will last another 400 years. That's a profound challenge, and it's a challenge that we either support or neglect at every single moment of every day. So thank you for sharing these moments with me, and I'll look forward to talking more at drinks.